In this lesson, what we're going to do is we're going to take a look at how to create and manage some of the more common configuration settings for our web applications. Web applications are going to be the containers eventually for our data. They contain our site collections, which in turn contain our sites, which in turn contain our lists, which in turn contain our data. We're going to see how to do this inside of central administration, how to do this in PowerShell, and how to go in through central administration and manage some of those more common settings. But let's start off by talking a bit about the basics of our web applications. Our web applications, as we mentioned earlier, connect into IIS. Our web applications hook up to a website. Now we can create as many websites inside of IIS as we might need, just keeping in mind that each website has to differ on one of at least three things: the host header, the port number, or the IP address. Now the host header is simply a DNS name. One big thing to keep in mind is that SharePoint is not going to update DNS for you. That's going to be your responsibility. The port number is where my user puts in a colon and then a port number afterwards, typically not something that I'm going to be setting up inside of any form of a production environment, simply because chances are my users aren't going to know to punch in the port number. My developers will, so it could be very useful for development, but not so much for production. And then finally, my IP address. One real quick thing to note about the IP address is that typically is also going to require that you update DNS as well, because usually you're going to associate a different host name with that IP address. Our web applications also become a context for content databases. Whenever I create a web application, I'm going to be required to create a content database. I can add additional content databases to a web application, keeping in mind that a content database cannot be shared across multiple web applications. My web application is also going to determine the different authentication mechanisms that are available. It's going to determine the overall mode, and this could be claim-based or classic. Classic, by the way, is Windows only and is not the recommended best practice for SharePoint 2013. Claims-based, on the other hand, is the recommended best practice. In fact, it's the only option that I can choose if I'm creating a web application through the UI, and it allows me to choose whatever authentication mechanism I might want, including Windows, Forms-based, ADFS, and even OpenID. And then finally, last but not least, it's at the web application level that I get to pick and choose which service applications I want to make available. So if I have one environment where I want search and another environment where I don't, one of the ways that I can implement that is by setting up a separate web application, and then on that brand new web application, just don't configure search. Now, one important safety tip that I want to highlight about our web applications before we start getting into any of our demos is a little thing called loopback check. The reason that I like to highlight this here is because we're now going to get into using different host names for our system. And I'm of course just running this right from my SharePoint 2013 system. What the loopback check is going to do is whenever I connect to a system, one of the first things that Windows is going to do is check to see whether or not I'm connecting to the local system. And if I am, then what it's going to do is it's going to check to see whether or not the host name that I'm using is the name that's been assigned to the system. So in my case, for example, the name of my system is SharePoint 2013. If I connected to a URL that was intranet.geektrainer.com, what's going to happen if I'm physically sitting at that box, which again I am, is Windows is going to go, oh, okay, well, we're looking at our local system. The name of the system is SharePoint 2013. You're using intranet. That's not going to work because those don't match. So the loopback check is a little bit of a security thing. And what it's going to do is it's going to make sure that the host name that you're using is in fact the name of the local system. Now, what's interesting about the loopback check is that it's not just simply going to tell me, hey, you're using the wrong name. Instead, what it winds up doing is just doesn't authenticate. So you'll notice it'll just keep prompting you for a username and password over and over and over again. And you're going to keep thinking, well, why in the world won't it just connect? That's the reason why. The fix for this is one of two things. On production, what I want to do is add entries into the host file. So I just open up the host file, add in the host name, and add in the local IP address, and away I go from there. Now, the nice part about that is that that's a more secure mechanism than the second option. Because in order to add in a brand new host name, you're going to need to be an administrator on that box. And remember, kids, once somebody's an administrator on that box, they now own that box. There's no such thing as a hack that requires administrative access. The hack is that they got administrative access in the first place. So if they got administrative access, that's my problem, not that they updated the host file. Now that works very well for production, where I'm generally going to have a limited number of host names, and where I'm typically not going to be physically remoting or sitting at that box. That typically I'm going to be sitting at my desktop, just fire up a browser and connect. But when we talk about development, I'm quite frequently going to need a lot of different web applications. Because I'm going to need to go in and test different scenarios that if I enable this, I activate this, I turn this off, is all of this going to work? And so when I go in and I start creating all of my different web applications, I don't want to have to update that host file every single time. So on development, where I'm not as concerned about security, what I can do is just simply tell Windows, don't do the loopback check. And the way that you do that is just by adding in a disable loopback check D word to the registry with a value of 1, and you're going to put that into HKey local machine, system, current control set, control, LSA. By the way, that's already been done on my local system. Now to go in and create our web applications, we can do this in one of two ways. Through central administration, we can choose Application Management, Manage Web Applications, and hit New, or through PowerShell, we can do New SP Web Application. And what you're going to notice is that we've got a whole host of different switches, including the name, the URL, the port number, the application pool account, and the authentication provider. A couple of real quick things that I want to mention about these switches before we go do our demo. Number one is if I want to use an existing application pool, then what I'm going to do is just simply provide the application pool switch, but I'm not going to provide the application pool account. If you provide the application pool account, what's going to happen is PowerShell is going to create a brand new application pool for you. And if it turns out that there was already one in existence, it's going to fail out. The other one is the authentication provider. This one's kind of interesting. I actually kind of get a kick out of this one. Remember how I said that the best practice is to use claims-based authentication? In fact, in the UI, not only is it the default, it's the only one that I can do. In PowerShell, interestingly enough, the default is classic, not claims-based. So what I need to do is I need to go get the appropriate authentication provider. And the way that you do that, by the way, is just by simply making a call to new SP authentication provider. Now, on my demo system, I've already gone in and created the DNS entry, so that way I don't have to worry about them. So I've already created a DNS entry for intranet2013.geektrainer.com. And I've created two for what's eventually going to become a later demo for my host header site collections at sales.geektrainer.com and hostheader.geektrainer.com. I've also set up a couple of scripts in advance, just so that way you don't have to watch me type these huge long commands, and I guess more importantly, so it minimizes the chance that I'm going to have a typo. Let's take a look at how to create our applications by using central administration. I'm going to hit Start, and I've got central administration pinned right there. So let me just click on that, and we'll give that just a second to come up here. Now, to create a new web application, I need to get to the Manage Web Applications screen. I can do this by clicking on Application Management on the left side, and then clicking Manage Web Applications. I can click on Application Management on the right side, and then click Manage Web Applications. Or I can just skip to the end and click right on Manage Web Applications. And then from here, you're going to notice that I can create a brand new web application by clicking on New. Now the first thing that this is going to do is it's going to ask me about my IIS website, and I'm going to call this SharePoint-intranet, and I'm going to give this a host header of intranet 2013 geektrainer.com. Now, a couple of real quick little notes here. Number one is the port number and the host name. The one thing that you're going to notice that's missing from that list is IP address. If I want to create a web application for a different IP address, what I actually have to do is create the website inside of IIS first manually, and then choose the option just up above to choose an existing website. The second thing that I want you to notice is the path. The path is going to be where SharePoint's going to write out the files that it needs on the file system to make the magic of the application work. SharePoint is, after all, an ASP.NET application, and there are a few file system resources that it's going to need, including a web.config file. Web.config, for those of you not familiar with ASP.NET, is an XML file that's used to configure how I want an ASP.NET application to work. Now you'll notice that it's going to create it in the C drive. I'm actually just fine with that. It's not going to impact performance if you put it anywhere else. I'm going to scroll on down, and you're going to notice about our security configuration, whether or not we want to allow for anonymous, and whether or not we want SSL. We're going to get more into security in a different lesson, but what I want to highlight about both of these is the fact that you'll notice that these are at the web application level. The reason for that is because it's the web application that's going to determine whether or not anonymous access is allowed at all, and it's also going to determine whether or not SSL is going to be available. Additionally, if you're going to set up SSL, you're also going to be required to set up certificates as well. Down below, I've got my different authentication types. So if I want Windows, if I want Forms, or if I want to use another provider, I can put the appropriate check marks into place. I'm just going to go with the defaults here. I'm going to scroll on down, and then you'll notice it'll ask me about a sign-in page if I want to use the default or create my own custom one. I want to use the default. And then it's going to ask me about the public URL. That public URL is what the users are going to connect to. We'll talk more about our zones when we get in to alternate access mappings. And then down below is going to be our application pool, and I'm going to set this up so that this will use a brand new pool that I'm going to call Web Applications, and I'm going to have this use that SP 2013 service managed account that we created in another lesson. Then I'm going to go ahead and specify my database, and I always like to name my databases SharePoint _ the name of the application, which in my case is going to be intranet 2013 _ and then content. I always like to preface my databases with the name SharePoint, so that way when my DBA goes to look at the list of databases, he can very quickly identify which ones are for SharePoint and which ones are for something else. By leaving the dot next to Windows Authentication, it's going to use that managed account, in our case SP 2013 service, to connect. I'm going to scroll on down. You're going to notice my failover server. That's if I'm using mirroring, so I can point that at a mirror server. I've got my service applications, so I can pick and choose those as needed. And then finally, last but not least, I can choose whether or not I want to send experience information to Microsoft and then eventually click OK, and let my web application be created. Now you are going to notice this is going to take a couple of moments on most systems, because what's happening behind the scenes is actually a fair amount. That it's getting the website together inside of IIS, it's setting up the initial file structure that's going to be needed to support this web application, and it's also creating the database that's going to house my content. So this may take it a couple of moments. Now that our web application has been created, we then get a little screen saying, hey, congratulations, you've now created this. It'll give me a little bit of information about forms-based authentication, and then it'll ask me whether or not I want to create a site collection. Now, managing and working with site collections is another lesson. But one of the things that I do find that people quite frequently get confused about is where a web application sits. Because after all, a web application is nothing but a container, that it doesn't actually provide a UI. The UI, by the way, is provided by a site. And our site is connected to our site collection, and our site collection is connected to our web application. So if I actually want a UI, I'm going to need to create a site collection, which, by the way, will automatically, in turn, create for me a top site. So I'm going to go in and create a site collection just so that way we can see that everything is in fact working. But I'm not going to worry too much about going over all the different options because, again, we've got a different lesson for that. So you can basically kind of take this next little spot and tantamount to magic. So I'm just going to click Create Site Collection. I'm going to give this a name of intranet, and I'll give it a description of demo intranet site. And I'm going to scroll on down. I'm going to provide my username. Just simply type in the name, hit enter, and then eventually down at the very bottom here, I'm just going to click OK. And now what this will do is this will create my site collection, and it'll create my top site for me and give me my little UI. So now let me click the link to open this up. And this is going to take it a couple of moments here. The reason that it's going to take it a couple of moments here is because of the fact that, once again, SharePoint's an ASP.NET application. And so what it wants to do is it wants to cache and precompile as much as possible, so that way it doesn't have to keep compiling pages and individual DLLs every time that a user goes to access a brand new resource. On top of that, SharePoint wants to precompile and pre-cache an awful lot as well to help further improve performance. So we're just going to have that initial hit of having to wait for everything to compile, and then once that happens, then everything should move along at a relatively decent clip. And so there is a UI provided by a site, provided by a site collection, provided by that web application that we just created. Now let's take a look at how we could create a web application by utilizing PowerShell. And I'm going to bring up the PowerShell ISE integrated scripting environment. Now, for those of you not familiar with the PowerShell ISE, what this is it's a tool to use to create your PowerShell scripts. And among other things, this will give me color coding and IntelliSense, which is a very nice bit of autocomplete. Now what I'm going to do is I'm going to load up my scripts here. And the first one that I've got is my Create Web Application. Now what you're going to notice in the script, first up, is my call to add PS Snap-in, Microsoft SharePoint PowerShell. That's going to load up the necessary PowerShell commandlets for managing SharePoint. Now you'll also notice the error action afterwards, and that's just to simply disable the error message that will typically come up of, hey, this is already loaded, if maybe you decide that you want to run this from the management shell, or maybe I've got another script that calls this one. Then what I need to do is I need to go get my claims-based authentication provider, and that's again because inside of PowerShell, the default is to use classic authentication rather than claims-based. I want to use claims-based authentication, so I'm going to go get that authentication provider just by making a call to new SP authentication provider. That's all that needs to be done. I'm going to put that into a variable, and then what you're going to notice is I'm going to make the call to new SP web application, specifying the name, which will become the name in SharePoint and in IIS, the URL, which will become the public URL, the port number, the host header, both of those will be inside of IIS, the application pool, and you'll notice in my case that I'm not using the application pool account, because if I use the application pool account, this is going to want to create a brand new application pool. Then I've got the name of the database and the server, and then finally that authentication provider that I grabbed earlier. So now all I have to do is just simply hit run and let it do its thing. Now while this is doing its thing in the background, what you're going to notice down below is the output window. And the output window isn't going to give me anything. The reason that we're going to want to use SharePoint's PowerShell capabilities is not to typically do this on a day-to-day basis, but to really help automate things. So for example, one of the other things that I could do inside of here is I could actually go ahead and create that initial site collection. Or maybe I could go in and, with a little bit of magic, even create my DNS entries as well, or maybe assign a couple of permissions. So those are the types of reasons why you want to utilize PowerShell. Now what you're going to notice is that sure enough it tells me that it was created, and if I go back to my central administration site, just simply hit OK on that screen there, give it a moment, and hit refresh, you're going to notice that I now have that host header application created. So there's how we create our web applications. Now let's turn our attention to managing them. Now we can, if we want, manage our applications by using central administration or by using PowerShell. Now you are going to notice that there's not a whole lot in the way of commandlets to go in and manage some of the different settings, that a lot of times what you need to do is go get the web application object and just simply set properties on there. So as we go through the demos here in a couple of minutes, you're going to notice that I'm just going to focus in on central administration. Now some of the different options that we have are default quotas. Quotas, again, allow me to limit the amount of storage space that's available for site collection. I can set a default quota for all site collections for a particular web application. Now what's nice about that is that if I'm going to be setting up an environment where my users are going to go in and create their own little meeting sites, their own little team sites, or more importantly, the web application that's going to host my sites should have a default quota set on there. So that way I don't have a user who pulls out their camera, takes a couple hundred pictures at a company function, and then just simply pulls out their SD card, pops it into their computer, and uploads that into their My Site. Now don't get me wrong, those are the types of things that I do want on my sites. I just don't want, 500 megs worth of pictures from the holiday party. I'm just saying. So that's where default quotas can be very helpful. We can also, at the web application level, disable alerts and RSS. Now typically we're going to want to leave those on, but we may decide to turn them off simply because of the fact that there is a little bit of additional overhead involved with both of those. Alerts, by the way, allow my users to get emails in response to things like new items being created, while RSS feeds allow my users to fire up a tool like Outlook and see all of the different changes that have been made to a list. And then we also have our recycle bin settings as well. Our recycle bin, by the way, comes in two different phases, primary and secondary, or sometimes known as site and site collection. It'll sit inside the primary recycle bin for X number of days based on whatever it is that I configure, And inside of there, that will actually be available to whoever it is that deleted it and anybody else with permissions to that item. After that number of days, it'll then get moved to the site collection recycle bin or secondary recycle bin, where only SCAs, site collection administrators, would be able to restore that. Let's take a quick look at our general settings. I'm going to go back to my Start menu, go back to Central Administration, and I'm going to go to Manage Web Applications. And then what you'll notice is I'm going to click on Intranet, and then right up top, I've got my General Settings, and then General Settings. And then from inside of here, you'll notice that I've got a whole host of different settings that are available. But again, the couple that I called out are my default quota, whether or not I want alerts, and the maximum number of alerts that a user can create, my RSS settings, and if I keep on scrolling down here, you're going to notice that we've got our recycle bin as well. The last little item that I want to mention is the maximum upload size. That you'll notice that by default, that's set to 250 megs. Now, that's going to be just fine in most scenarios. But one of the things that is pretty cool with SharePoint and Excel is a little thing called Power Pivot. And what Power Pivot will allow is for a user to actually download large portions of a database and be able to slice and dice that data as needed. Well, those Excel spreadsheets are going to wind up becoming rather lengthy because of that fact. So I may need to go in and increase the size so that way my users can upload those spreadsheets. Next up is our resource throttling. Resource throttling allows me to dial back how many items are going to be returned on a list view, unique permissions, etc. Basically, these are all the different things that can wind up slowing things down in SharePoint. So to start with is our list view threshold. And our list view threshold will allow me to limit the number of rows that are going to be returned by a query against a list, by a filter, or if you go in and create a view based on that view. Now the reason that that's in existence is so that way I'm not going to return back 100,000 items to my user, that I'm only going to return back a couple thousand items at the absolute most. We also have a separate threshold for auditors and administrators. So if we need to execute reports on this, then we've got that capability and we can go beyond what the normal threshold is. We can also control whether or not code could override that threshold setting by simply turning off or turning on the object model override. The daily time window for large queries is going to be the time window in which you could actually execute queries without having the threshold be applied. The list view lookup threshold is used to limit the amount of lookup columns that are going to be created on a view. One of the big things that you can do with SharePoint when you're modeling your data is you can actually point columns at other columns in other lists. Now what's nice about that is that it allows me to create parent-child relationships. The downside, however, is that this is going to incur a bit of a performance overhead. Because in order to display all that lookup data, what SharePoint has to do is go contact each list. So what I can do is limit the number of lookups that are allowed inside of a view. And then finally, last but not least, is the maximum number of unique permissions. SharePoint, out of the box, by default, does a little thing known as security trimming. Security trimming is where we're going to not show items to users that they don't have permissions to. Now there is no magic there. That in order for that to work, What needs to happen is SharePoint needs to go in and take a look at where your permissions are. Well, if there is 10,000 individual permissions on a list, that's going to take SharePoint a little while to have to sift through each one of those. So I can use that threshold to limit the number of unique permissions. Again, this is all done at the web application level, and we're going to do this by going into Central Administration. Let's take a look. Back to my Start menu, back to Central Administration, back to Manage Web Applications, back to my intranet, and then under my General Settings, I've got Resource Throttling. And from inside of there, you're going to notice the couple of defaults there, that by default, an individual view is limited to 5,000. For auditors and administrators, it's limited to 20,000. A view is only by default able to show 8 lookup columns. And if I scroll on down, you're also going to notice that we've got our time window for large queries. So I could maybe, for example, say from midnight until 3 a.m., you're allowed to run those types of queries. And you'll notice my list unique permissions threshold. So that allows me to throttle back how many items are going to be available, how many unique permissions you're allowed to apply to help improve the overall performance of our web application. A couple of other last remaining settings that I can configure on web applications. First of all is our service connections. Our service connections allow us to choose which service applications are going to be available to a web application. We have the ability to choose the authentication providers, so that way if I want to add or remove forms-based authentication, I can do that. And you'll also notice that we can choose to block certain file types. So if I don't want executables, ISOs, or other types of files like that uploaded into SharePoint, then I can do that by setting up my blocked file types. Let's take a look at where those are inside of Central Administration. What I'm going to do is go back to my Manage Web Applications, and I'm going to click on my intranet. And from here, first of all, you're going to notice my service connections. And my service connections allow me to choose what it is that I want available as far as my service applications go. So if I drop this down and I choose Custom, you'll notice that I can add and remove my connections as needed. You're also going to notice under my authentication providers that right here I can click on the zone in question, which in my case is going to be default, and then this will show me all of my different authentication options, whether or not I want anonymous, and if I scroll on down, if I want forms-based, Windows, or any other provider that may have been installed. And then finally, last but not least, is the blocked file types. Just simply a huge list of the different extensions that are not allowed to be uploaded. Now keep in mind that it's only going to do this based on the extension, so it's not going to have the built-in capability to open up the file and truly see what it is. So obviously the easy way around this is just to rename the extension when you go to upload it. But that's oddly okay, because what we're really trying to do here is we're trying to prevent somebody from uploading an executable and then somebody else clicking on it and then having that install a virus or otherwise onto their system. Now if somebody does try to upload a blocked file type, then what's going to happen is they're going to get a little error message flat out telling them, hey look, you're not allowed to upload this file type. And there's how we can create our web applications and manage some basic settings. And I'm going to see you in the next lesson.